Chapter 6. The Central Tree. The Tree of Life, the Middle Tree, the highest there that grew. Milton. Sowohl der Apfelbaum und die Quelle, als auch der Drache des Hispanengartens werden in den Mythen und Märchen der meisten Völker in das Zentrum der Natur, an den Gipfel des Weltberges, an den Nordpol verlegt. Wolfgang Menzel. In the center of the Garden of Eden, according to Genesis chapter 3, verse 3, there was a tree exceptional in position, in character, and in its relations to men. Its fruit was good for food. It was pleasant to the eyes, a tree to be desired. At first sight, it would not perhaps appear how a study of this tree and the different mythologies of the ancient world could assist us in locating primitive paradise. In the discussions of such sites as have usually been proposed, it could not. But if the Garden of Eden was precisely at the North Pole, it is plain that a goodly tree standing in the center of that garden would have had a visible and obvious cosmical significance which could by no possibility belong to any other. Its fair stem, shooting up as arrow-straight as the body of one of the giant trees of California, far overtopping, it may be, even such gigantic growths as these, would to any one beneath have seemed the living pillar of the very heavens. Around it would have turned the stars of the god, as if in homage, though its topmost branches the human worshipper would have looked up to that unmoving center point where stood the changeless throne of the Creator. How conceivable that the Creator should have reserved for sacred uses this one natural altar height of the earth, and that by special command he should have guarded its one particular adornment from decoration. If anywhere in the temple of nature there was to be an altar, it could only be here. That it was here finds a fresh and unexpected confirmation in the singular agreement of many ancient religions and mythologies in associating their paradise tree with the axis of the world, or otherwise, with equal unmistakableness, locating it at the Arctic pole of the earth. That the Northmen conceived of the universe as a tree is well known to ordinary readers. Its roots are in the lowest hell. Its mid-branches enclose or overarch the abode of men. Its top reaches the highest heaven of the gods. It was their poetical way of saying that the whole world is an organic unity pervaded by one life. As the abode of the gods was in the north polar sky, the summit of the tree was at that point, its base in the south polar abyss, its trunk coincident with the axis of heaven and earth. It was, therefore, in position and in nature precisely what an idealizing imagination magnifying the primitive tree of paradise to a real world tree would have precluded. But while most readers are familiar with this Norse myth, few are aware how ancient and universal an idea it represents. This same tree appears in the earliest Akkadian mythology. And what is precisely to our purpose, it stood, as we have before seen, at the center or pole of the earth, where is the holy house of the gods. It is the same tree which in ancient Egyptian mythology enclosed the sarcophagus of Osiris, and out of which the king of Byblos caused the roof pillar of his palace to be taken. But this was only another form of the Tat pillar, which is the axis of the world. In the light of comparative cosmology, it is quite impossible to agree with Mr. Renouf in his treatment of the tree in Egyptian mythology. It is neither the rain cloud, nor the light morning cloud, nor the transparent mist on the horizon. His own citations of texts clearly show that under all its names the Egyptian tree of life is a true world tree, whose trunk is coincident in position and direction with the axis of the world, a tree in whose sky-filling branches Bennu, the sunbird, is seated, a tree from whose north polar top the north wind proceeds, a tree which, like the Yggdrasil, yields a celestial rain that is life-giving as Ardvisuras, and that descends, not merely upon the fields of Lower Egypt, but, like Ardvisuras, to the underworld itself, refreshing those who are in Amenti. The superterrestrial portion of Egyptians' Yggdrasil, therefore, like that of the Northmen's, stands at the Arctic pole. The Phoenicians, Syrians, and Assyrians had each their sacred tree in which the universe was symbolized. In the lost work of Pericles, the former is represented as a winged oak. Over it was thrown the magnificent veil, or peplos, of Harmonia, on which were represented the all-surrounding ocean with his rivers, the earth which with its omphalos in the center, the sphere of heaven varied by the figures of the stars. But as this self-interpreting symbol was furnished with wings to facilitate its constant rotation, it is plain that we have in it not only a world tree, but also one the central line of whose trunk is one with the axis of heaven and earth. In the language of Mori, it is a conception identical with the Yggdrasil of Scandinavian mythology. That section of tree, therefore, which reaches from the abode of men into the holy heavens rises pillar-like from the pole of the earth to the pole of the sky. Among the Persians, the legendary tree of paradise took on two forms, according as it was viewed with predominant reference to the universe as an organic whole, or to the vegetable world as proceeding from it. In the first aspect, it was Geocorina tree, or the white home. In the second, the tree of all seeds, the tree opposed to harm. Of the former is written, "Everyone who eats of it becomes immortal." Also, in the renovation of the universe, they prepare its immortality therefrom. It is the chief of plants. On the second we read, "In like manner as the animals, with grain of 55 species and 12 species of medicinal plants, have arisen from the primeval ox, so 10,000 species among the species of principal plants, and 100,000 species among ordinary plants, have grown from all these seeds of the tree opposed to harm, the many-seeded. When the seeds of all these plants, with those from the primeval ox, have arisen upon it, every year the bird strips that tree and mingles all the seeds in the water. Tishtar seizes them with the rainwater and rains them to all regions. Where stood this tree which, in its dual form, was at once the source of all other trees and the giver of immortality? Every indication points us to the northern pole. It was in Erenvej, the Persian Eden, and this we have already found. It was at the source of all waters, the north polar fountain of Ardvisura. It was begirt with the starry girdle of the zodiacal constellations, which identifies it with the axis of the world. It grew on the highest height of Heraberizeti, and this is the celestial mountain at the pole. Finally, although Grill mistakenly makes the Chinvat Bridge correspond with the Milky Way and the rainbow, he nevertheless correctly discerns some relationship between Chinvat and the Persian tree of life. By this identification, we are again brought to the one unmistakable location toward which all lines of evidence perpetually converge. The Aryans of India, as early as in the far-off Vedic age, had also their world tree, which yielded the gods their soma, the drink which maintains immortality. As we should anticipate, its roots are in the underworld of Yama, at the hidden pole, its top in the north polar heaven of the gods. Its body is the sustaining axis of the universe. Weber long ago expressly identified it with the world ash of the Edda, and Kuhn, Senart, and all the more recent writers accept without question the identification. Grill's interesting sketch of the historic developments of the myth may be seen in the appendix to this volume. Some of the late traces of it in Hindu art betray the ancient conception of the pole as a means of ascent to heaven, a bridge of souls and of the gods, a stair substituted for the slippery pillar up which the Taoist emperor vainly sought to climb. Among the Greeks, it is more than probable that their holy palm in Delos, on which Leto had laid at the birth of Apollo, represents the same mythical world tree. If so, and if we follow Hecatius in locating the scene, we shall be brought to the Arctic pole. The eternally flourishing olive of Athene seems also but another form of the holy palm, and this, in some of its descriptions, brings us again to the land of the Hyperboreans. In the garden of Hesperides, in the tree which bore the golden apples was unquestionably the tree of paradise, but following Aeschylus, Pherecydes, and Apollodorus, we must place it in the farthest north, beyond the Riphaean mountains. Traces of the same mythical conception among the Romans are presented by Kuhn. The sacred tree of the Buddhists figures largely in their sculpture. An elaborate specimen representation may be seen on the well-known Sanchi Tope. One inconspicuous feature in the representation has often puzzled observers. Almost invariably, at the very top of the tree we find a little umbrella. So universal is this that its absence occasions remark. This little piece of symbolism has a curious value. In Buddhist mythological art, the umbrella symbolizes the North Polar heaven of the gods, and by attaching it to the tip of the sacred tree, the ancient sculptors of this faith unmistakably showed the comical character and axial position of that to which it was attached. But this cosmic tree was the mythical Bodhi tree, the tree of wisdom. Its location is in the middle of the earth. Notwithstanding his doctrine of an African origin of mankind, Gerald Massey says, in the legendary life of Gautama, Buddha is described as having to pass over the celestial water to reach nirvana, which is the land of the Bodhi tree of life and knowledge. He was unable to cross from one bank to the other, but the spirit of the Bodhi tree stretched out its arms to him and helped him over in safety. By aid of this tree he attained the summit of wisdom and immortal life. It is the same tree of the pole and of paradise all mythology through. The tree of the Guarani garden, the Hebrew Eden, the Hindu Jambudvipa, is likewise the tree of nirvana. This final application of the imagery proves its origin. The realm of the rest was first seen at the polar center of the revolving stars. The ancient Germans called their world tree the Irminsul, i.e. heaven pillar. Grimm speaks of its close relationship with the Norse Yggdrasil and lends his high authority to the view that it was simply a mythical expression of the idea of the world's axis. The same view is advanced still earlier by the distinguished Icelandic mythographer Finn Magnusson. How profoundly the myth affected medieval Christian art is illustrated in many places, among the rest in the sculptures on the south portal of the baptistry at Parma. It is also not without a deep significance that, in the medieval legend of Seth's visit to the Garden of Eden, to obtain for his dying father the oil of compassion, the tree of life which he saw lifted its top to heaven and sent its root to hell, and that, on the crucifixion of Christ himself, the arbor que ab initio posita est. This cosmical tree of the garden died and became the arbor sec of medieval story. The paradise tree of the Chinese Taoists is also a world tree. It is found in the center of the enchanting garden of the gods, on the summit of the polar Quanlun. Its name is Tong, and its location is further defined by the expression that it grows hard by the closed gate of heaven. As in many of the ancient religions, the mount on which, after the flood, the ark rested was considered the same as that from which, in the beginning, the first man came forth. It is not strange to find the tree on the top of the mountain of paradise remembered in some of the legends of the deluge. In the Taoist legend, it seems to take the place of the ark. Thus we are told that one extraordinary antediluvian saved his life by climbing up a mountain, and there and then, in the manner of birds plaiting a nest, he passed his days on a tree, whilst all the country below him was one sheet of water. He afterwards lived to a very old age, and could testify to his late posterity that a whole race of human beings had been swept from the face of the earth. It is at least suggestive to find the same idea of salvation from a universal deluge by means of a miraculous tree growing on the top of the divine mountain of the north among the Navajo Indians of our own country. Speaking of the men of the world before our own, and of the warning they had received on the approaching flood, their legends go on. Then they took soil from all the four-corner mountains of the world, and placed it on top of the mountain that stood in the north. And thither they all went, including the people of the mountains, the salt woman, and such animals as then lived in the third world. When the soil was laid on the mountain, the latter began to grow higher and higher, but the waters continued to rise, and the people climbed upwards to escape the flood. At length the mountain ceased to grow, and they planted on the summit a great reed, into the hollow of which they all entered. The reed grew every night, but did not grow in the daytime, and this is the reason why the reed grows in joints to this day. The hollow internodes show where it grew by night, and the solid nodes show where it rested by day. Thus the waters gained in them the daytime. The turkey was the last to take refuge in the reed, and he was therefore at the bottom. When the waters rose high enough to wet the turkey, they all knew that danger was near. Often did the waves wash the end of his tail, and it is for this reason that the tips of the turkey's tail feathers are to this day lighter than the rest of his plumage. At the end of the fourth night from the time it was planted, the reed had grown up to the floor of the fourth world, and here they found a hole through which they passed to the surface. The opening sentence of the above citation gives us a topography exactly corresponding to Mount Meru, the Hindu mountain of the north, with its four corner mountains of the world, in the four opposite points of the horizon. Moreover, in the deluge myths of the Hindus, as in this one of the Navajos, it was over this central mountain that the survivors of that world destruction found deliverance. However explained, the coincidences are remarkable. In Celtic tradition, the tree of paradise is represented by the tree which bore golden apples in Avalon. But Avalon is always represented as an island in the far north, and its lodestone castle self-evidently connects it with the region of the magnetic pole. In the ancient epic of the Finns, the Kalevala, we see the world tree of another people. If any doubt could rise as to its position in the universe, the constellation of the Great Bear in its top would suffice to remove it. Thus the sacred trees, like the sacred waters of every ancient people, invariably conduct the investigator to lands outside the historic habitats of the peoples in question, and ever to one and the same primeval home country, the land of light and glory at the Arctic Pole. Eastward to the left, and westward to the right arm and lung. Chapter 7. The Exuberance of Life. And the Lord God planted a garden, and out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The Book of Genesis. Moreover, there were a great number of elephants in the island. There was provision for animals of every kind. Also, whatever fragrant things are in the earth, whether roots, or herbage, or woods, or distilling drops of flowers or fruits, grew and thrived in that land. The Critias of Plato. Wie verkehrt man überhaupt geht, wenn man lediglich aus dem Krise unserer jetzigen Erfahrung die Urwelt konstruieren will, haben und die paläontologischen Entdeckungskursen der neueren Zeit gelehrt, die eben und der Urwelt uns die riesenhaftesten und wunderbarsten Tiergestalten vorführen. Dr. H. Lucan. According to all ancient traditions and beliefs, the cradle of the human race was in a portion of the world characterized by an altogether extraordinary exuberance of life. Of all lands, the sun shone upon it was the fairest and best. Even down to the deluge, and later, something of the divine goodness of that primeval homeland remained. In the eyes of Plato, the steady deterioration has been going on from the beginning, the good soil washing down from the heavenly mountains of the earth's summit and disappearing in the abyss, until, in comparison with what then was, there are remaining only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called, all the richer and softer parts of the soil having fallen away, and the mere skeleton of the land being left. The deterioration of the climate of the mother region of the race is particularly described in the first Fairguard of the Avesta. The first of the good lands and countries which I, Ahura Mazda, created was the Ariana Vajo, Iran the ancient, by the good river Daitya. Thereupon came Angra Mainyu, who is all death, and he counter-created by his witchcraft the serpent in the river, and winter, a work of the Devas. There are now 10 winter months there, 2 summer months, and these are cold for the waters, cold for the earth, and cold for the trees. So in Fargard II, we have a legendary account for the successive migrations of the earliest remembered men out of the original North Country southwards to meet the sun, and nearly all commentators ascribe these repeated southward movements to the gradual refrigeration and glaciation of the primitive home in Iran the Ancient. The same idea of a perfect primeval climate is found among all ancient peoples. Ovid represents the spring, in Saturn's reign, to have been perennial. The spring of our world age is only an abbreviated reminder of that great original. So Lactantius has preserved a fragment of the old ethnic creed when he tells us that only upon the loss of paradise, darkness and winter came over the earth. With this supposed deterioration of soil and climate, the deterioration of man kept pace. Hence ancient writers, with hardly an exception, represent the men of their own day as far inferior in stature, in strength, and in longevity to the first progenitors of the race. Hesiod, Aratus, Ovid, Virgil, and Claudian vary somewhat in their accounts of the golden, silver, and later ages of human history, but all agree in representing the men of their time as weak and puny and short-lived, compared with men of the early ages of the world. Juvenal, in a well-known passage, alludes to Homer's judgment and expresses his own. Nam genus hoc vivo jam describat Homero, terra malos homines nunc educat atqui pusillos. Plato, speaking of the antediluvians, says, "For many generations, as long as the divine nature lasted in them, they were obedient to the laws, and well affectioned toward the gods who were their kinsmen, for they possessed true and in every way great spirits, practicing gentleness and wisdom in the various chances of life, and in their intercourse with one another. By such reflections, and by the continuance in them of the divine nature, all that we have described waxed and increased in them. But when this divine portion began to fade away in them, and became diluted too often, and with too much of the mortal mixture, and the human nature got the upper hand, they, being unable to bear their fortune, became unseemly, and to him who had an eye to see they began to appear base, and had lost the fairest of their precious gifts." The ancient Indian conception of the world's decadence from period to period is given in the Laws of Manu. Of the 4 great ages of the life in the present universe, we are living in the last, and worst. In the first Yuga, all men were holy. In the present, all are utterly corrupt and vile. In the first, they were tall and long-lived. In each succeeding age, they have grown dwarfed and feeble. Similar to the Indian was the Iranian belief as reflected in the Buntaish. Here, the duration of the universe is represented as filling 4 world periods of 3,000 years each. During the first of the 4 is pure and sinless, but at its close the evil one declares war against Ahura Mazda, the holy god, which war is destined to fill the 3 last ages. During the first of the 3, the evil one is unsuccessful. During the second, good and evil are exactly balanced, while in the last, which is our own, evil obtains until distant overthrow at the very end maintains supremacy. The conception which we are noticing is as old as it is universal. Berosus, reporting the earliest traditions of Chaldea, represents the first men as of extraordinary stature and strength, and as retaining in lessening degree these characteristics until some generations after the flood. Among the Egyptians, says Lenormant, the terrestrial reign of the god Ra, who inaugurated the existence of the world and of human life, was a golden age, to which they continually looked back with regret and envy, to assert the superiority of anything above all that imagination could set forth. It was sufficient to affirm that, like it had never been seen since the days of the god Ra. The same idea is found again in the Egyptian account of the succession of the terrestrial reigns of the gods, the demigods, heroes, and men, as collected from the fragments of Manetho and corroborated by the testimony of native texts. In China, too, the Catholic ethnic faith is a primeval golden age was not lacking, so that everywhere the eldest traditions, be they Shemitic, Aryan, or Turanian, support, confirm, and illustrate the representations of the Bible touching the extraordinary pristine vitality of Edenic nature and of antediluvian man. So overwhelming is the evidence that this universal belief of antiquity is a reminiscence of primitive reality. The one who expressly disclaims a personal belief in the superior stature of the early men nevertheless asserts that the universality of the popular belief attests its very ancient origin, and adds that it may unhesitatingly be ranked among those originating at a time when the great civilized people of a remote antiquity, still clustering about the cradle of the race, enjoyed a contact sufficiently close for some common traditions. The bearing of this unanimous verdict of ancient tradition upon the problem of the location of Eden is obvious. The traditions of the whole ethnic world, not less than the record in Genesis, require that the cradle of the race be placed in the one spot on earth where the biological conditions are the most favorable possible. According to all procurable data, that spot at the era of man's appearance upon the stage was in the now lost Miocene continent, which then surrounded the Arctic Pole. That in that true, original Eden, some of the early generations of men attained to a stature and longevity unequaled in any countries known to post-Diluvian history is by no means scientifically incredible. On the contrary, the exceptional biological conditions of that land and the remarkable consensus of all tradition respecting the vigor of early giant races combine to form a fresh illustration of the principle that the more incredible things an hypothesis explains, the more irresistibly credible the hypothesis itself becomes. Back in that far-off foretime, even in the lower latitudes, life was remarkably luxuriant. The paleontologists almost exhaust the resources of language in the effort to describe it. Thus, on a single page, Professor Aline Nicholson of St. Andrews University says, "The life of the Miocene period is extremely abundant, also extremely varied in its character. The marine beds have yielded numerous remains of both vertebrate and invertebrate sea animals, an enormous number of plants. The remains of air-breathing animals are also abundantly found. The plants of the Miocene period are extraordinarily numerous. The plant remains indicate an extraordinarily rank and luxuriant vegetation." Figuier gives the following illustration. "The lycopods of our age are humble plants, scarcely a yard in height and most commonly creepers. But those of the ancient world were trees of 80 or 90 feet in height. But we have before seen that the mother region of all these abounding and varied floral and faunal types was within the Arctic Circle, and from their amazing exuberance in low latitudes we may form some conception of the yet superior potencies of life which were at work in that more highly favored circumpolar seed plot of the whole earth." In our last chapter, it was suggested that the tree of the midst of paradise may have been as lofty as one of the giant sequoias of California. The comparison was not made at random. In the Miocene remains in Britain, conifers are especially numerous, and the most abundant of these is a gigantic pine, the Sequoia couttsii, which is very nearly allied to the huge Sequoia gigantea of California. A nearly allied form, Sequoia langsdorffii, has been detected in the Hebrides. From the latitude of the Sequoia Grove in Mariposa County, California, to that of the Hebrides is a long stride toward the pole. But we are not left to mere inference when we raise the question whether the original starting point of this gigantic tree species may not have been still higher in the Arctic regions. The Miocene fossils of the highest attainable Arctic latitudes tell their own story. Limited as have been the explorations among these fossils, as Sir Charles Lyell remarks, more than 30 species of coniferae have been found, including several sequoias allied to the gigantic Wellingtonia of California. There are also beeches, oaks, planes, poplars, walnuts, limes, and even a magnolia, 2 cones of which have lately been obtained, proving that this splendid evergreen not only lived, but ripened its fruit within the Arctic Circle. Many of the limes, planes, and oaks were large-leaved species, and both flowers and fruits, besides immense quantities of leaves, are in many cases preserved. Even in Spitzbergen, within 12 degrees of the pole, no less than 95 species of fossil plants have been obtained. The vigor of the vegetable life of the Miocene age in these Arctic regions impresses the veteran geologist as truly remarkable. We have a right, then, not only to draw a conclusion from the abundant and extraordinarily rank and luxuriant vegetation of the Arctic regions in Miocene time, but also to learn a special lesson from the gigantic forms which linger on our western coast. Had the book of Genesis described one of the trees of Eden as 320 feet in height and 30 feet in diameter at the base, not only all the Voltaires of modern history, but also, until the discovery of California, all naturalists of the advanced anti-Christian variety would have made no end of sport over the unscientific or mythical botany of Moses. But the Sequoia gigantea is a living, indisputable fact. Though not the oldest of the coniferae, it illustrates some of the earlier possibilities of vegetable life. It tells the botanist that growths once realized in great abundance are dying out, and unless perpetuated by human care are soon to disappear from our globe forever. The last surviving representatives in the state of nature, preserved to our day by certain fortunate local conditions and by their own inherent longevity, are witnesses respecting a far-off world, witnesses whose testimony the most incredulous must accept. They tell of the faraway dawn of the day of man. They bear testimony to the extraordinary life which characterized their distant birthland. And if these last individuals of an expiring race can maintain, under unfavorable biological conditions, a vigorous and thorough 2 millenniums of time, who shall declare it impossible that the men of the time and place of the origination of the Sequoia gigantea should have averaged more than 6 feet in stature, or attained to an age quite surpassing our 60 years and 10? As to the latter point, it would require more than the combined lives of 2 Methuselahs to watch the growth and death of a single tree like those of California. The thought is not the incubation of the present writer, it is what the trees themselves said to the foremost botanist of America. But the exuberance of animal life in the Miocene period is not less remarkable. We quote the same author as before. The invertebrate animals of this period are very numerous. The little shells of the foraminifera are extremely abundant. Corals are very abundant, in many instances forming regular reefs. Numerous crabs and lobsters represent the crustacea. Of insects, more than 1,300 species have been determined by Dr. Heer from the Miocene strata of Switzerland alone. The mollusca are very numerous. Polyzoans are abundant. Bivalves and univalves are extremely plentiful. The fishes of the period are very abundant. The remains of reptiles are far from uncommon. The land tortoises make their first appearance during this period. The most remarkable form of this group is the huge Colossocheles atlas of the upper Miocene deposits of the Siwalik Hills in India, described by Dr. Falconer and Sir Proby Cotley. Far exceeding any living tortoise in its dimensions, this enormous animal is estimated as having had a length of about 20 feet, measured from the tip of the snout to the extremity of the tail, and to have stood upwards of 7 feet. The accomplished paleontologists just quoted show further that some of the traditions of the Hindus would render it not improbable that this colossal tortoise survived into the earlier portion of the human period. The mammals of the Miocene are very numerous. The edentates are represented by 2 large European forms. One of these is the large Macrotherium giganteum. The other is the still more gigantic Ankylotherium pentelici, which seems to have been as large as, or larger than, the rhinoceros. We may also note here the first appearance of true whalebone whales, 2 species of which, resembling the living right whale of the Arctic seas, and belonging to the same genus, having been detected in the Miocene beds of North America. The great order of ungulates, or hoofed quadrupeds, is very largely developed in strata of the Miocene age, various new types making their appearance here for the first time. we meet for the first time with representatives of the family Rhinoceridae, comprising the only existing rhinoceroses. The family of the tapirs is represented, some of which were quite diminutive in point of size, whilst others attained the dimensions of a horse. Nearly allied to this family also is the singular group of quadrupeds, which Marsh had described under the name of Brontotheridae. These extraordinary animals, typified by Brontotherium itself, agree with and differ from the existing tapirs. Brontotherium gigas is said to be nearly as large as an elephant, whilst Brontotherium ingens appears to have attained dimensions still more gigantic. The well-known genus Titanotherium would also appear to belong to this group. The family of the horses appears under various forms in the Miocene, but the most important and best known of these is the Hipparion. Remains of the Hipparion have been found in various regions in Europe and in India, and from the immense quantities of their bones found in certain localities, it may be safely inferred that these Middle Tertiary ancestors of the horse lived, like their modern representatives, in great herds. Amongst the even-toed ungulates, we for the first time meet with examples of hippopotamus, with its four-toed feet, its massive body, and huge tusk-like lower teeth. The true deer, with their solid bony antlers, appear for the first time here. Perhaps the most remarkable of these Miocene ruminants is the Silvatherium giganteum of the Siwalik Hills in India. In this extraordinary animal, there were two pairs of horns. If all these horns had been simple, there would have been no difficulty in considering Silvatherium as simply a gigantic four-horned antelope. It is to the Miocene period that we must refer the first appearance of the important order of the elephants and their allies. Only three generic groups of this order are known, namely the extinct Deinotherium, the equally extinct mastodons, and the elephants, and all these three types are known to have been in existence as early as the Miocene period, the first of them being exclusively confined to deposits of this age. The most celebrated skull of the Deinothera is the one which was exhumed from the Upper Miocene deposits of Eppelsheim in Hesse-Darmstadt in the year 1836. This skull was 4.5 feet in length, and indicated an animal larger than any existing species of the elephant, whilst herbivorous quadrupeds, as we have seen, were extremely abundant during Miocene times, and often attained gigantic dimensions. Beasts of prey were by no means wanting, most of the existing families of the order being represented. Weasels and otters were not unknown, whilst the great cats of subsequent periods are more than adequately represented by the huge saber-toothed tiger. Amongst the rodent mammals, and all the principal living groups were differentiated in Middle Tertiary times. Lastly, the monkeys existed during the Miocene period under a variety of forms. The Drypoithecus is referable to the group of anthropoid apes. Dryopithecus is also of a large size, equaling man in stature, and apparently living amongst the trees and feeding upon fruits. It would be easy to heighten the impression of this vigor and luxuriance of animal life in tertiary and post-tertiary times by studying the huge bird tracks of the Connecticut sandstone, or the enormous skeletons of the Dinornis giganteus and the Dinornis elephantophus, or the eggs of the Apornis maximus, eggs measuring from 13 to 14 inches in diameter. We might consider the Diprotodon, which in size must have many times exceeded the dimensions of the largest of its living successors, since the skull measures no less than 3 feet in length. Or we might rehabilitate the colossal Megatherium cuvieri, whose thigh bone is nearly thrice the thickness of the same bone in the largest existing elephants. Or again, visiting the Jurassic beds of our own Colorado, we might contemplate the Titanosaurus, one of the latest discovered of the tenants of the early world, of which Sir John Lubbock says that it is perhaps the largest land animal yet known, being 100 feet in length and at least 30 feet in height. Though it seems possible that even these vast dimensions may have been surpassed by those of the Atlantosaurus, also a late discovery. But why multiply illustrations? Natural history in our times can produce no species of fishes, or of amphibians, or of reptiles, or of birds, or, among mammals, of marsupials, or of edentates, or of ungulates, or of proboscideans, or of carnivores, or of apes, which in normal dimensions are not excelled by species of the corresponding orders and classes belonging to tertiary and quaternary ages. And this being so, it is surely possible and credible that in the same antediluvian ages, some of the varieties of species Bamana may have exceeded in stature its present average, and enjoyed a corresponding vigor of constitution. At any rate, it will be soon enough to deny it after human remains of suitable age shall have been found in the vicinity of the race's origin and earlier history. So far as past findings are concerned, even Buchner, who holds that primitive man was inferior even in corporal attributes to the men of the present day, and that the widely spread belief in the former existence of a race of human giants is perfectly erroneous, still has to say, it is true that some very ancient skeletons or parts of skeletons have been found, which must have belonged to comparatively large and very muscular men, such, for example, as the skeleton of the famous Neanderthal man, and the human bones recently found by Monsieur Louis Lartet in one of the caverns of Perigord, which seem to indicate a rude but muscular race of men. Again, speaking of the skeleton to which the Neanderthal skull belongs, he says, "The ridges and crests, especially which served as points for the insertion of the muscles, are very strongly developed, so that we may conclude that their possessor was a very strong and muscular man." It may be added that Karl Vogt, one of the earliest and most influential of Darwin's German disciples, also conceived of the man of the oldest Stone Age as of large stature, powerful and long-headed. Here it may be well to remark that the primitive forms of animals, while often so excelling in size the later forms of their own kind, are by no means to be thought of as monstrosities. The proportion of a young child's head to his body is very different from that of an adult's. In comparison with the growth man, his limbs and hands and feet are remarkably plump and well-rounded. Had a painter never seen and studied a human being except in the adult and sentient stage, the infant form would seem to him singularly abnormal. This illustration may help to a right judgment of the certain early types of animals. For if we take the earliest known and oldest examples of any given group of animals, it can sometimes be shown that these primitive forms, though in themselves highly organized, possess certain characters such as are now only seen in the young of their existing representatives. In technical language, the early forms of life in some instances possess embryonic characters, though this does not prevent them often attaining a size much more gigantic than their nearest living relatives. Moreover, the ancient forms of life are often what is called the comprehensive types. That is to say, they possess characters in combination such as we nowadays find only separately developed in different groups of animals. Now this permanent retention of embryonic characters and this comprehensiveness of structural type are signs of what a zoologist considers to be a comparatively low grade of organization, and the prevalence of these features in the earlier forms of animals is a very striking phenomenon, though they are nonetheless perfectly organized so far as their own type is concerned. To put the mistake to be guarded against in another light, it may be said that whoever considers the departures of the most ancient forms of animal life from the allied living forms as abnormal and monstrous, in many cases simply takes the types of decadence and senility by which to test and condemn the plumper and fuller and fairer types of physical juvenility. In like manner, the comprehensive types can be called monstrous and strange only as these terms might be applied to the London Times, by a man who in all his life had never seen any other specimen of journalism than the North British Wool Growers' Monthly Bulletin, or the Daily Price Current of the Southampton Associated Grocers. What the zoologist calls the lowest forms of organization are rather the highest, if by highest we mean those forms which are most inclusive, lebenskraftig, and susceptible to evolutionary differentiation. The notion that the faunal world at the time of the advent of man was a world of credulities and monstrosities, a notion to which books and magazines of popularized science have given an almost universal currency, is therefore entirely false. In the light of profounder science, the fairest Eden of the oldest legend is, so far as primeval zoology is concerned, more credible than when the study of paleontology was first begun. It must not be forgotten that in all that has now been hinted respecting the fauna of the early world, no accounts has been taken of more favorable and less favorable portions of the earth. Paleontologists are but just beginning to consider that between the biological conditions of the Arctic regions and those of every other portion of the globe, there must have been, in pre-glacial times, the profoundest and most far-reaching difference. The growths of a region whose day was 10 months in length, and whose night was but 2, could not fail to be vastly different from those of the regions where, on average, almost 12 hours of every 24 are spent in darkness. Nor can we overlook the fact that the plants and shells of the Arctic region are eminently variable. If, therefore, in low latitudes the forms and powers of animal life were what we have seen, who can undertake to depict its superior exuberance and variety of manifestation in that primitive polar focus from which all faunal types proceeded? The Arctic rocks tell of a more wonderful lost Atlantis than Plato's. The fossil ivory beds of Siberia excel everything of the kind in the world. From the days of Pliny, at least, they have constantly been undergoing exploitation, and still they are the chief headquarters of supply. The remains of the mammoth are so abundant that, as Graticap says, the northern islands of Siberia seem built up of its crowded bones. Another scientific writer, speaking of the islands of New Siberia, northward of the mouth of the river Lena, uses this language: "Large quantities of ivory are dug out of the ground every year. Indeed, some of the islands are believed to be nothing but an accumulation of drift timber and the bodies of mammoths and other antediluvian animals frozen together. So full of these remains is the soil of these high Arctic regions that the Ostiaks and other ignorant tribes have an idea of the mammoth is an underground animal plowing his way through the earth like a mole, and that he still lives in his subterranean passages. Nor would there seem to be anything so remarkably novel in the theory we have advocated in this book, according to which the submergence of the primeval home of mankind and the introduction of the great ice age are connected with the deluge. For when, nearly 200 years ago, the Russian ambassador, Evert Idis, made his bold 3-year overland journey to China, he and the high north found and reported this precise traditionary belief." Summing up the present chapter, then, we have only to say that whoever accepts the conclusion to which the preceding lines of argument have conducted us will find no longer a stumbling block in the latest revelations of geology, touching the extraordinary life energies of far-off ages, and in the hoary myths which tell of giants and titans and demigods in Earth's early morning. On the contrary, fossil form and ethnic myth are sacred, and sacred page will all be found uniting in a common story.